Nancy McGuckin, who's been in the travel behavior business for a whole long time and is well known actually around the country as one of the people who has done a lot of work on the NHTS, the National Household Travel Survey. She can even tell you when questions were changed, things like that, and why they were changed. And so she knows probably more about the details of national travel behavior, I think, than just about anybody. And she's just finished a project, and this is for the state of California, right? On walking and biking in the state of California, and that's what she's going to present to us today. So, welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? So thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate this opportunity. This is on, I'm going to just talk quickly about some of the results I found from two different reports I've done. The walking and biking in California is for Caltrans. It was a safety-oriented study, and the other one was travel to school, for the safe routes to school. But before we get there, I'm going to do a quick overview of the NHTS to make sure that we all know what it is. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. So I'll go fast and while you finish your lunch. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the myths and some of the evidence about walking and biking. I was surprised in California to find so many people going, really? That's what you found? So I put some of that stuff together to see if it would surprise you too. Then I wanted to spend 2 minutes talking about the value of these large-scale descriptive data sources for this kind of thing. I know there's a lot of value in small, local data collection, but there's also value in these big data sets, and I think it's worth taking a minute just to remind ourselves what that is. And then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about using your own experiences as inspiration for the kind of research that you might do. I found that to be really interesting in my own life, and I'm anxious to hear what you have to say. So very quickly, just a description of why the California, Caltrans, the Department of Transportation, purchased an add-on. They wanted the add-on data to obtain data performance measures for safety and mobility. One of the problems with the California Household Travel Survey that's currently going on is it's not completely comparable from one area to the other, and there's no standard update period. So that for using it for performance measures and for comparison, that makes it kind of difficult. One of the biggest issues was California has a very high fatality rate for pedestrians, higher than other areas in the country. And the biggest question for this Department of Transportation is, why is that? Could it be that people walk more? Or is it really that it's much more unsafe? And they needed data in order to answer that question. So then there was this idea of characterizing the trips of walking and biking, which I'll talk about quite a lot, just to, for multimodal planning, for understanding at the local level. And then there's this idea of informing policies that require benchmark and performance measures, like the safe routes to school. They've been in business for 10 years. What kind of results can you attribute to something like the Safe Routes to School program? So the California Household Travel Survey, as I call it, is 21,225 households that were sampled in the state of California using the National Household Travel Survey questionnaire and procedures. So the interviews were conducted in English and Spanish. There was a monetary incentive. You guys may know all of this. I'll just quickly remind us all. The response rate was pretty high compared to some of the address-based samples, but of course there's non-coverage issues because of cell phone only. The Safe Routes to School program was added. A special module was added in the last iteration, 2009, just to look at children's travel to school, and it was administered across the nation. Everybody got it. But since there's a large statewide sample in California, you can actually do some trends for the state from just the national survey. And of course, the margins of errors for the most recent one are really small because the sample's so big. And I love the data for looking at active travel and non-motorized because it can tie in the socio-demographics of the traveler, their household characteristics, their vehicle ownership and use characteristics, their location characteristics. All of that gets tied into their behavior for the day. And I find that to be unique and really, really nice depth. So here it is. These are the samples. It was sampled by district, which is something nobody uses, it turns out, but the state of California Department of Transportation. But that allows you, and you'll see that later, I do go into planning regions. They're called metropolitan planning organizations. You can look at those specifically for the large ones, large transit markets, MSAs, and you can combine different areas. San Diego, as you note, has a larger sample than it would have normally gotten because they want to look at bicycle trip generation and see if they can do something really unique with bicycle planning. So the California NHTS has a very traditional memory jogger. This is sent to households for them to keep track of their travel for a single day. It's really straightforward. It is not an activity diary. Nobody asked them about what they're doing. It was the purpose of the trip. Why did you go there? How did you go there? How far was it? So the weighting is really important, and I go into great detail in the walking and biking in California if this happens to interest you. It's important because of the undercoverage issues that are associated with cell phone-only households. When this survey was conducted, that estimate nationwide was about 20% of households were cell phone only. And the information that they had was that California actually had fewer cell phone only households than that average. It's still huge. And now, of course, it's up to 30%. So these types of RDD telephone surveys have big non-coverage issues. There was a separate cell phone only survey that was done, but it was too small to use those data in any way except to inform the weighting. So the weighting became very, very important because it allowed that non-coverage to be diminished by making the weights of people who would normally not be in the survey, like Hispanic, renter, African American, low income, large. But you'll see when you use the data that can be problematic too because it means those margins of error are very large as well. So it has more than biking and walking in the NHTS. You guys, have you used the NHTS? Okay, a few. It's pretty cool. It's got everything. And this is just a small set. You can see over here, let's see, I'll use my thing. This is the school-aged, the travel to school, one random student, one random child between the ages of 5 and 15 was selected. It means you have to use a special weight, the SFWGT. And if you, because it's different than the person weight, but they're weighted up to each child. And we have lots of information about transit use, which we'll get into. So I wanted to just talk about some of the evidence that I found, just what is the characteristic of walking and biking behavior here in the state of California. So there's a myth that nobody walks in LA, but it's not true. Nearly 18% of the trips in LA County originating in LA County are by walk. And that's the second most common type of travel, depending on how you measure private vehicle. But this led me to a little question of whether mode share was a really good performance measure. And I have a brief on my website devoted specifically to this topic. The little fade-in rectangles show that for people 5 to 15 and for people 40 to 49 years old, they have the same per capita walk trips, 146 a year. But their mode share is very different, 12.5% and 9.3%. So the blue bars are the mode share and the red line is the per capita. And you can see how different those measures are. Now, one of the reasons that they're very different is it depends on how much driving there is. Driving is such, it just pushes everything so much because it's the majority of travel. When driving as a numeric estimate, when the amount of driving in the country fell in 2008, that big bar on the end, it pushed everything else up. As a proportion of all travel, everything went up. So many, many agencies and advocates achieved their benchmark goals of increasing walking without doing a thing. And that's sad because a real measure would require real effort and real results. So it also, the trip definition also affects the amount of walking and biking that are measured. So in the National Household Travel Survey, the trip definition is one address to another. So every trip segment becomes a trip. For walking and biking, the farthest point was a broken point, so they could assign a location. So that became two trips, an outbound trip and an inbound trip. But what I would like to just talk about momentarily is this idea of the walking associated with transit. You can see like trip number 1 and trip number 4 both have a walk component, which isn't actually measured separately.
What about walking to like the garage to get your car? Does that count?
We ask people in a separate section of the questionnaire how much walking you did outside, but we don't know how people respond to walking to the mailbox or walking to their garage. I would guess that most people do not consider that a walk. But walking to transit is clearly a walk. And these are short distance trips, but if you just look at the amount of walking they add in these big transit markets in California, it's quite a lot. They wouldn't add much distance, and of course they're not going to change mode share, because if they were trips, they would be added to the total as well as to the transit. But these then become significant.
Is there anything like walk to work similar to what you have in census?
Yes, we actually, the walk to work, it has two ways that it's asked on the NHTS. One is exactly the way it's asked in census. How, if you were a worker last week, how did you usually go to work? And then that trip diary I showed earlier has your actual travel day. Oh, I should have put that in there. On my website, there's a brief about looking at your usual behavior and your actual reported behavior on the travel day. So sometimes we get two estimates of whether you walk to work. And when you look at those together, it's kind of interesting. But these walk to transit are really big, important livability and safety measures, because where our transit locations, they're very dense urban areas. Often there's a lot of traffic of other types, and there's also lots of walkers, there's lots of conflict. So it's important to keep these in mind in all kinds of measures. And it's interesting that they're a little hard to get out of the National Household Travel Survey. But as long as I'm talking about mode share and per capita transit as two different measures that tell two different stories, this one was really interesting to me too. It's transit. The mode share of transit bounces around, and it's pretty hard to say what's going on. There's high, there's low, it goes up again. There's no real mode share story that I can see. But when you look at a per capita transit trend throughout the history of the survey, which started in '69 actually, I don't use that data because it's just paper, but the '77 is electronic. So you can actually go back and use that data and run things. So when you look at that, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? It looks like transit is actually increasing on a per capita basis. So this is a myth. Young adults are more likely to walk than older people. Nationwide, that graphic is, or the orange one, it went too fast. The orange one is nationwide, and younger people your age, I guess that's 16 to 29, are about as likely as somebody 60 years old to walk. But when you look at just high density urban areas, the story is completely different. And it's very, that's the blue bars that came in a little bit later, and you can see the 16 to 29 slightly lower than children. And that's one of the concerns, is that people walk less when they get to driving age. But they bump back up again, and the younger people walk more than the older people in dense urban areas. So density has a huge effect on walking. And some of the problem is that most people in the United States live in very low density areas. The little dot is LA County, 850 households per square mile, and 4.1 walks. So higher than average for the density, but still very low density. So the red line is the percent of people in the US by the density of their housing units, and the blue line is how many walks. You can see it's a very clear relationship. But the population growth in the last 50 years has really been in the suburban areas, pretty much all of it. And the suburban areas have fringed out and sprawled out, we know that, into what used to be rural land. But also there's stuff going on like smaller families. There are now a lot of single persons in pretty large suburban households or houses. The houses are big and their lots are big. So all of that has contributed to this lower density that people are living at. Makes it hard to provide walkable communities. It makes it hard to provide transit. But there's another myth that children are the ones that bicycle. But actually, bicycling stays pretty steady throughout young adulthood. Children who bike become teens who bike, become young adults who bike, become adults who bike. And all of that first 3 bars at the bottom's all within the margin of error, so you can say they're substantially the same amount of biking. But back to this density issue, the stuff in LA, is it too far apart to walk to? Compared to other big metro areas in the United States, LA has more trips of 1 mile or less and more biking for those short trips than Dallas, Fort Worth, and I'm not showing all of the, I think that's Atlanta is the second bar. I squished it. But let me tell you what this chart really shows. This thing is the percent of all travel that's 1 mile or less. So in New York metro area, almost half of the trips measured from address to address are 1 mile or less. And then this blue business on the bottom, that is what percent of all those trips that are 1 mile or less are by walking and biking. So about 50% in New York. So you could say half the trips are 1 mile or less, and about half of those are by walking and biking. So you can see, and I guess this is San Francisco. 31.6% of all the trips that we measured were less than a mile. And almost like 41% or so of those were by walking and biking. So LA is this unmarked one right here, because I squished my chart. About 1/3 of the trips are 1 mile or less, and about 1/3 of those are walking and biking. More than Dallas, more than Atlanta, and more than the national. So there's also a myth that back in the olden days, people used to walk a lot more. And it's interesting because you imagine, I guess, Mayberry RFD, that's probably way too old for you guys, but some mythic area where people walked all the time. But it's actually from the time that the NHTS has been measuring travel, and especially 77, people were already driving. The walking has not really changed that much. So here I have that since 1983, it's really about the same. And we don't, I think if you're interested in how the measure has changed, how the questions have changed, I do have a lot of that on my website. And there is bump around based on just wording changes and stuff. But over this long period of time, the travel diary has remained virtually the same. And it's really interesting that you can use those same measures for such a long time. So that leads me into what the value of these really large national data sets are. There's trends analysis, of course. We looked at some of that. There's comparison between areas and populations that you can do when it's all apples to apples, done at the same time, in the same way, using the same questions. That's critical for performance measurement because you have to know that you're measuring some external change and not fiddling with the way that people perceive the question. And especially I want to talk about the safety and exposure rates. So I could have put this in the myths, but the children in California are actually walking more than they were in the past, and that surprises people. And it's unlike what's happening in the rest of the country. So the very end is 2009 California. That blue part is all, let's see, that's walks to school, this bottom part. And this part is walks for all other purposes, and they both increased. In comparison between areas, it's really interesting to me in California that walking overall as a mode share of all travel between the areas is not that different. So you have San Diego gets 12.6 and Sacramento 11.7, a little on the lower end, and San Francisco and SCAG, the 6-county Southern California Council of Governments Planning Region, Both get about the same, 14.5%. So about the same proportion of trips for people in the areas are by walking. But when you look at children walking to school, the differences become a lot larger. And that's real interesting to me. I think there's a livability measure in that. Because in, say for instance, in San Francisco, more children go to private school and charter schools, and they're farther away. And they're in the 6-county Southern California region, more children are from poor and Hispanic households, and they have smaller and more local schools. And so this allows children to walk. There are more children within the 2 miles to school distance threshold that the Safe Routes uses in Southern California than in San Francisco. And that's interesting. There's more children in Southern California who have 2 parents, at least one parent at home who's not working in the afternoon when they get off of school, which might allow them to walk home from school. There's lower income, of course, and in Southern California area than there is in San Francisco. So these kinds of differences impact how many children walk to school. And you can see that it has a pretty big impact. So when you compare things between areas, one of the things you want to know is what are the areas that we would target normally? Where would we put our priorities in terms of improving things? And not surprisingly, in the California add-on, people had some differences. People in different areas identified these barriers, and the areas clustered. Streets are too wide. The district with the highest percentage of people saying that was Los Angeles. And the second highest was Eureka. No sidewalks. Redding and Fresno were the top 2 areas that people said that was their biggest barrier. So you can go through and see that these, if I was at the state and I was looking to put some scarce resources into improving walkability across the state, I might target some of these areas and some of these specific issues for people. It's really interesting to look at different population groups. These large data sets are big enough to include enough samples so you can say something about new immigrants versus other people which are native born. And so new immigrants are much more likely to say they walk every day. And if there's an issue about safety in an area, that might give you a hint of where to put your educational resources to reach people who might not speak English perfectly. Maybe they have a different, I think this happens quite a lot. They have, has anybody here driven in South America or tried to cross the street? There's like a different culture, you know, you have to put on your macho and get out there and do it. Where here, you just get hit when you do that. So it's a very different kind of thing, and I think targeting some of the educational resources would be helpful in improving those safety statistics. And I guess, you know, the other thing is the people who do health are very concerned about walking as a measure of activity. And you can see that, is it Asians and Hispanics and Asians most likely to report 0 walks. Well, their neighborhoods might not be safe, or they might not feel safe. Or maybe they have other issues. My mother-in-law, there was a big windstorm here like a year ago, and the trees pushed up the sidewalk. And she used to be able to walk around the block for exercise, and now that one sidewalk, she's afraid she's going to fall, so she doesn't walk anymore. And she's actually declined quite a bit in health because of that. So it's interesting how just these little tiny things at the very local level can make such a big difference in the health and wellness of a person. And speaking of older people, the California add-on includes special questions related to travel disabilities. Not many people know this. If you're interested, it's a really nice source of information. There's questions about whether you need help with walking, what kind of walking aids you use. But this is, I guess, what I see when I see this chart is if we all live long enough, we're all probably going to have trouble walking. And I love Sandy Rosenblum, who says that it's like an old lady who can get out of her front door and walk around the block is like the canary in the coal shaft for a livable community. She's still singing because it means that you have a livable community. if an 86-year-old woman can walk out her door and go for a walk for pleasure during the day. And I think looking at the data that way, looking at the people that way, rather than trying to find the census data that defines the density, can be a very nice way to look at the data from another point of view and maybe illuminate some of the questions we have about what makes a livable community. But safety is the #1 reason for the add-on. It was really interesting to me because this is the result. When you use a population-based exposure measure, you do have very high fatalities here in California for pedestrians, higher than the nation. But it turns out Californians, in fact, do walk more. They walk 20 to 25% more than comparable people in the country, and the fatalities are about the same as other areas. They're 14.1 fatalities, I guess, per 100 million walk miles of travel. That's comparable to other states. It's terrible all the same, but it's not worse. The activity people are here, and they're going to be part of the transportation planning future. They want a say in transportation facilities development, and I think we need to embrace that as part of the wellness of our communities. Even though those averages, and this is a little bit like mode share, be careful of which measures you use. As smart people, get a couple of them going because they might tell you different stories. Average Californian walks 4.1 walks per week. Sounds good. But the distribution is terrible. A third of the people in California report no walks outside at all last week. None. They're not reporting their garage walk or going to get the mail. Can you, I don't know, I can't imagine not walking outside in a week. But it is true that many people now don't go outside very much. But the activity people would like to see more people reporting walks outside during a week. So this is really quick look at some of the ways that I think you could use your experiences to look at these data. With a little curiosity and your own experiences, you can find things that other people don't see. It's happened in my career, it's happened in Jen's career. So one of the really interesting things is how gas prices can affect travel. The NHTS has the months across 2008 and 9 when the gas prices first spiked up to $4 a gallon, and that's the red line. And you can see the green line, how people responded with increased walk and bike to work. And this is really interesting. You can see the same thing with transit, as a matter of fact. And people use these data to do all kinds of estimates of elasticities and forecast behaviors based on different costs for the cost per gallon of gas. But now, of course, we're all paying $4. This is, what, 4 years later? We're all still paying $4 and $4.50. So I don't know whether we're all still walking and biking to work. Sandy Rosenblum and I had a chance to do a real quick study of the equity issues between bus and rail. So the gas goes up, you get on the bus, you look around the bus, you go, who's on my bus? Who are these people on my bus? Or who are these people on the rail? And you can see that at least the income distribution is very different between bus and rail. And as big areas tend to favor rail improvements, which are very expensive, and serve people who might already have a vehicle, obviously are working, have higher incomes. Some of these equity issues come up because if it's a zero-sum pot of money for transit, and you take a big chunk and give it to rail, that means you have less to spend on bus. Sustainability, I love this one. There's also a brief on my website about CO2 estimation. It's not difficult to do, and it's really interesting to see how alternate and hybrid vehicles are infiltrating into the fleet. One of the things, the bluish green line shows you what proportion they are of all vehicles, and just remember, we got tons of vehicles in the US. Getting a percentage point change is huge. But then the red line just shows you how much they're used. And I think this graphic to me indicates that people might buy a vehicle like that because they drive a lot. And here in California, in Southern California at least, you can get an HOV. Can you still get an HOV sticker? Yeah, so. And I have a friend who has a Volt, so that's pretty cool. But it's, you know, it's coming on. I think these are things that are changing. But I wanted to get your idea because I was out at lunch yesterday with some smart women friends of mine, and we were imagining this polar whatever continuum. So on one side, you have to go out and travel for every single thing you want, and on the other side of this continuum, you can sit in your easy chair and have everything you need there. So in that world, why would you travel? In what instances would you actually go out and travel? And I think that we're getting closer to that than we think. And unfortunately, in my opinion, and I guess because I'm up here, I get to just pontificate, but in my opinion, the whole data world with big data and trace data is going in that other direction. We're going back to just measuring flows without knowing much about the people who are doing it. And in my opinion, the big questions coming up all deal with if you could sit in your easy chair and get everything you needed, in what instances do you choose to travel? And I really think that this is a huge open book for you all to write. I think you will see these changes in your own life. I'm particularly interested, did I put it up there? Social networking. Our friend Kai Oxhausen, who runs the European Travel Survey, talks a lot about how social networking has influenced long-distance travel. That you used to have friends that were in your neighborhood. You'd have, you know, cookouts with them. You'd belong to the bowling league, the PTA, and this was your social network. But now your social network is no longer associated with geography. It's all online. And so you make a friend in a quilting group, and you say, gosh, I'm going to be in Seattle next week. I have never met you in real life, but we've chatted for 2 years online. Can I come stay at your house? And they say, sure. Or you say, I would like to meet you. I would like to make a trip to meet this person. This happens all the time now, and it's, in my opinion, we're decreasing our local travel because of the internet, and we're increasing this long distance travel, and we are not measuring them at the same time in the same way. So I can't be proved wrong, but I can just say it. The other thing we're doing with all these deliveries is we're increasing commercial vehicle miles of travel. Just because you order it to be delivered to your house doesn't mean that all travel is decreased. There is a green positive. There is a net decrease, but those little vehicles that are delivering it to your house still have emissions and still have safety issues associated with them. So quick summary of findings. And I've got 3 slides, and that's the end. So overall, the evidence shows that Californians walk more than other people. The reason that's important to keep in mind is that when you're using national statistics, you might not be in the ballpark. You have to think about how different you are from other people. And so locally collected data, in this case, really does rule, especially for the exposure data. That made a big difference. And using it to bring to light the differences between populations in the state is going to be very important. So I think the greater exposure, this is the low-income school children, frequent bicyclists, new immigrants. These are the people with higher exposure rates, and that was not known until this data was collected. This is that distribution. This health issue is huge, and it's going to be part of transportation planning going forward. So the health advocates are interested in increasing the amount of activity, and we need to be able to measure that in similar ways across many areas to see if these impacts, if you can impact this. So I think that it's all these goals together, and it's so funny to me because the CDC people and the health people just can't see the connection to safety. And I'm thinking you need the same measures. You both have a pot of money. If we could combine resources, it would be so valuable because what is safe is livable and sustainable. And this is good for the health and wellness of a community. So if we can put all of that into one pie, I think it's a pretty powerful pie. I'm also very interested in aging And I think as the population ages, it's something that we all have to keep in mind. And I love the image of the old lady being able to walk out of her door for a trip. I think that's my goal. Children. This is the second report, Travel to School. You can just Google it. It just got published. Children in California have increased their overall walking. Now, is this related to the Safe Routes to School? There's some evidence that doesn't include California that Safe Routes to School does work. The state government just cut the funding for Safe Routes to School. So these are the kind of tiebacks that we need to make in policy and planning to show that the data, with evidence, evidence-based planning and policy uses data to show that the performance of a policy is good and therefore deserves to continue. And I think that that's what they're using the report I created for them as part of their efforts to get the state to reinstate funding for Safe Routes to School. And the children and the old people, they're our little canaries, so we love them. So when the world is changing, this is for you. When the world is changing, you can use your own experience and your own curiosity to do all kinds of cool analysis. The internet, the mobile apps, the vehicle choice, everybody's worried about Gen Y. What are they going to choose? Why do they all use transit? I think this is a very open area. And of course, everybody needs the age, the sex, the immigrant status, and all of that intersecting with these behaviors, hence these large data sets. So one last thing, this is CDC. They did a really nice graphic, I thought. I just wanted to show it to you because the way we communicate the information is important. And I'm bar chart queen. I got it. Got little fade-ins going on, but it's nothing like this. This is great, and it's worth spending time and effort to create the valuable, high-impact visual things because that's what people remember more than any bullet points and especially long, long, long white papers. So check out my website. You can contact me anytime. Thank you.
Questions?
So do you think does education play a role, for people to decide whether they want to walk or drive in terms of, their transportation mode choice?
Yeah, that's an important question because that shows how complex it is. Higher education people generally work farther from their home because they can afford larger homes, they can afford homes outside of the city, and they can afford to travel. So in that sense, they would be less likely to walk to work. But on the other hand, the evidence shows that higher income people walk more. But usually what they walk more for is they choose places to live where they can walk to things, or they walk for exercise, walk the dog. They know about the health benefits of walking and they put that into their life. So the work thing is worth taking a look at because I think you can have people who do travel a long way, but you can also have people who work at home. So that's when the averages become kind of suspect. You have to look at the different segments. Did that get your question?
Going back to the uncommon analysis slide, I completely missed that. And
Joan, go sure. What is
and kind of what you were thinking there.
I was just goofing around. I like college students. I'm thinking, okay, I'm a college student. This is probably how far I am from you, how lame this is. So gas is too expensive. I'm taking the bus. Now I'm on the bus. I'm looking around. I'm thinking, who's on the bus with me? So this is how my curiosity gets piqued in my own travel behavior analysis. I'm probably best known for trip chaining analysis. This was my big 5 minutes of fame. It happened when I was a new mother, and I realized that a working mother is forced to drop the kids somewhere before she goes to work. And then as long as you don't have the kids, you're probably going to try to sneak in some grocery travel, maybe even a Starbucks to go get some me time. I mean, so it was a big thing because in the 80s, the men were doing the analysis and they didn't understand that kind of behavior. That behavior came through my own lens as a person. And I think that that's kind of what I'm saying to you, is use your own lens, use your own experience, and your curiosity about what travel behavior is. And you will find things that other people are missing.
I think that's really interesting because there's been a big push recently to get more women biking and walking, and if you can understand the barriers and issues they face, which most people don't address, what to do with the kids, why the high heels maybe won't work,
Anybody talk about the size of that seat?
et cetera, et cetera. So I think that could be a really interesting area of study.
The data are there. They ask about barriers. You can look at mothers. You can look at life cycle. There's variables that define that. You can look at throughout their day whether they bike for recreation, but just not in their travel day. Look at the barriers for people who do that versus those who bike to work. This is all available, and I think that's a wonderful idea. That's the intersection of race, sex, and income across all of these things, because those are generally the different markets. Poor women are going to have different concerns, and new immigrant women are going to have different concerns. Perhaps it's a cultural concern than other people.
I just have to ask, on the 33% of people who haven't taken any walk trip in a week,
I think that's
what are we defining as a walk trip? How was the question asked?
I'll go all the way back, if I can, to this is the definition of a walk trip. In the NHTS, every one of those segments with a trip identifier is considered a trip.
That's the diary stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that question was based on the retrospective in a week, right?
That's right. Yeah, and actually, in the walking and biking report, I also made a brief out of it, I spend a lot of time looking at those two. So what Jen's saying is there's two ways that we asked about walking and biking in the big survey. One is on your travel day with the travel diary, and you just said, yes, I walked here, and then I walked there. The other is, because it's considered a rare behavior, we asked, how often did you walk outside for any reason, including exercise and walk the dog, last week? And that is where I get the pie, where 33% of the people said they did not walk at all outside for exercise or walk the dog or for any other purpose last week.
So did you, by any chance, take those 33% and see if anybody took a transit trip, just to check?
I'm depending on you to do that. That is a great idea. And also, I was thinking, why not take those 33% and just see who they were? Are they old? Are they lame? Are they workers? Are they busy moms? What percentage are in each of those categories? And then think about how you would target each of those groups differently to improve their ability to go outside for a walk. That'd be a great idea.
I'd like to just comment that the American Journal of Public Health had a study that came out this month in April, might be worth looking at, that talked about the occurrence of biking and walking trips and the relationship to safety. The safety piece always has to be there for it to pan out.
Yeah, and in transportation, safety is our North Star, they say. And I think this is the star that livability and sustainability needs to hook their hook on, because it's all the same goals. But for some reason, the silos are very sharply drawn, and there's not a lot of cross-fertilization.
Just wondering, vis-a-vis the survey, is there a kind of a time series for this, which is consistent? Every 5 years this comes out, or how do you do the trends analysis over a period of time?
Just, kind of whenever they have money. It says 5 to 7 years. But the good thing about this, just in looking at those long trends, is that travel at this big level actually changes kind of slowly. And I think we're entering a time where we've gone over that peak and it's changing faster now. But it turns out that 5-year time frame might just be about right. I mean, just to go in and check the temperature of travel behavior, how's it going? But the new survey is funded and yet not planned. So that's where we are.
Are they doing it, rolling it over a national, or is this only state of California?
No, it's a national survey. It's been conducted since 1969. There's a web portal I had somewhere. I've got all those fade-ins. It takes forever. I don't know. You guys, you're like little smartphone people. Just put NHTS. And you can also get my website, Travel Behavior.
Follow-up question. Can you get data at a city level? Is there a certain cutoff size that you have, population
The
size?
web portal for the national, it's only California state. If you want to go lower than that, the MSA is available on that data set, but that MSA is not very helpful. You really want county, I think. So to get county statistics, you have to get the data from either UC Davis or Caltrans. But as far as I know, they're handing it out. So it has the coded information for the household and the trip beginning in, for the county, for the MPO planning region, the Caltrans district, and I think that's it. But it's really, really helpful. Now, you're not going to have enough samples in any but the biggest, most populous counties. But if you look at this report, both of them, but I think on Safe Routes to School, I spent more time talking about the differences between areas because it turns out that only about a quarter of the households in California have a school-aged children. So the sample size was really sucked down right at the beginning. And you know, with 20 or 25% of the households in your sample, then what could you say at the county level? Not too much. But when I combine the counties into these planning regions, and I showed that one graphic with San Francisco and Southern California, those planning regions are big enough to say something about. So you have to do the margin of error. It's not that hard with SAS these days. If you have any trouble, just give me a call. I'm happy to answer any questions from my website. I actually pick up the phone pretty often. And I'm just happy to help if you're interested in doing this research.
Anything else?
So go ahead.
Can I know what's your confidence interval, like your sample size depend on?
I'm sorry?
Your confidence interval, your sample size depend on?
Well, like I was just saying, it depends on what variable you're using. Well, there's 21,225 households in the state of California. That's unweighted households. If you're interested, just Google walking and biking in California. I spend a ton of time right in the beginning of that report talking about confidence interval, the survey, the weights, and each one of the tables gives a margin of error for every estimate. It's a little boring, so I didn't put a lot of those charts in here, but it's kind of up to you. If you want to use a 20% error estimate, data that has a 20% error estimate because you don't have any better data, then it's up to you. If you want to decide that you're only going to use it with 5% error, that's up to you too. And I think with this data, it's difficult because the FARS is the fatal activity reporting, what's the S? System. That's 100% counts, we hope, of all deaths by, for pedestrians. So you're comparing 100% information to a sample. And that makes it a little difficult, but I do discuss that in the report, and I talk about margin of error. You had your hand up too? You did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In your analysis, for those people who are walking, what if they walk, for example, they walk from their home to the transit station and then they to the public transit to the walking place? How would you also count them as walking?
No, they're not counted as walking. That little walk segment is stuck on the transit trip. And that's why I showed that bar. I don't remember where it is, but there's a bar with the 33%. If you include those walks, it's quite significant in the big transit markets here in California. But in the older surveys, they used to ask, Why did you go there? They used to take this into segments and take the walk to the transit and then the transit and then the walk from the transit to your workplace. But then you had to put them back together to get a trip to work. So now they put them together and you have to take them apart to get a mode. So it's just which bad thing do you want?
So, Jung Woo, do you want to talk about how you got your walk data? Her dissertation is on walking to transit and use this data set.
Well, how I get the data?
Right, so you went through the process of unlinking those trips, right?
Right.
TRAGG1 through 10 or 5
Right.
or whatever it was. It's the name of the variable.
Yeah, but
Transit access.
you are talking about my essay one, right?
Yes.
Essay one, I was looking for how many times you used the transit in the last week. So it was not travel diary. It was,
The last week.
Right.
Mhm.
Last week, how many? Actually, it was last month. So how many times you used public transportation in the last month? So I did not, take out.
Didn't you looked at one point at the walk access to transit
Walk
in the travel diary.
for the first essay, I did not. No, I did not. Yeah, take
Okay.
the sample.
Yeah, it's there. It's a little hard to dig out because the variables are weird and you have to put them all together. If they took, we did it for the guy in New York. He says, okay, in New York you have very complex commutes. You can walk to the ferry, then take the ferry, then walk from the ferry to the transit thing, and then you take the bus, and then you take the train. He wanted it all, and he was an add-on. So it's a little complicated, but if you look at it, pretty much everybody else in the country falls off after walk to transit. There are really not that many really complex commutes outside of New York City. So when you look at transit, sometimes it's good to keep in mind New York's a whole nother animal. And sometimes I take New York out and separately analyze it and then everywhere else. Because maybe a quarter of the transit trips reported in the nation are in New York. 1/3. It's huge.
Just a comment. Recently we filled out an AQMD survey, right? And I don't know if you've seen that, the Air Quality Management District survey. I think it's for large employers. It's kind of disconcerting to see it, just kind of lock in the categories the way it is. It does not break out the trips. So you could have driving, public transit, and walking, and it's a travel diary for 5 days, in a certain week, but it does not give you the option. Then I'm just wondering whether there could be something that the state could do if the air quality districts are mandated to reach out.
Could they improve those
Could they
data
do that?
collection?
And on an annual basis, they do that.
Wow, that'd be a great suggestion. I'm working with California Air Resources Board on a complete streets. This is a funny story, and I won't take too long, but I worked with the Pasadena Department of Transportation, and they did a complete street thing, and it was all in their mobility plan, all transportation. In Santa Monica, I'm working on a complete streets project with the California Air Resources Board and UCLA, completely outside of their transportation plan. It has nothing to do with the transportation plan. This is what I'm talking about. If we can pull in air quality, health, safety, get those silos broken down and put together, you could probably get a better product and you could have more complete streets. So the California Air Resources Board project has been in the planning stage for 2 years. And the Pasadena Mobility Plan is about to get done. So just different.
Adding to the next point is about the walking measures. So NSTS has those data. So how about the transit access and transit egress by walking. So we can know how many minutes they walk to get there and get from there. So we can note, I'm actually using those variables for my second essay. I think you were confused about this.
I think you're one of the first people that I've talked to look at that. So I'm really interested in how well it works, because I know you have to take the whole travel time And then you have to take out the middle transit time, the in-vehicle time, and the wait time, and then estimate the walk time. So I'm curious if that works well or if that's just really painful. It sounds painful.
Well, for my second essay, I was looking for how many minutes they are walking for a day travel. But what I found is that transit walking time is really major walking time for people.
That's interesting.
During a weekday.
Wow.
It-
And their whole
You're
day.
losing a great deal.
You're using a great deal. Well, we're not losing, it's just buried under, you
That's
know,
what I mean, it's
a
not
big
being-
X on the treasure chat map.
And that's the beauty of bicycle, right? Because it can decrease, the trip by bike can eliminate that barrier if the distance to transit is too far.
Yeah. And I think it's the value of having people who are really devoted to dig into this and make something out of it and bring it. There's a role for people like me and like you, which is to take this data set, which is big and hard to get to know, and make information of it and distribute that to people. I think that's a role, an actual, maybe I'll say of myself, unappreciated role, but it is a role. And it's necessary because we have this complex data that the national, you know, government collects, even the census, and then we have decision makers who will not take the time, they don't have the time to go into it the way that you or I might. So this is the role.
Any other questions? Should we say oh, sorry, what?
You talk about a little bit about the internet services, and I think using smartphone, it really matters when you decide your mode of transportation. So do you have any question about the having smartphone and using those kind of apps to check the bus schedule?
That's such, you know, I think the next survey will have, but I'll tell you a quick story from me. I was in Denmark staying with a friend, and we're drinking coffee in her kitchen, beautiful morning. She's got to go to work. I didn't know what I was going to do. And her phone rings, and she goes, oh, that's my bus. So puts on her coat, grabs her briefcase, goes out, catches the bus, and I'm like, that is what I want. You know, that's what I want. And it's here. It is actually here. Where's my bus is here. So you can do that, and that it is going to make it easier to use and more reliable to use other modes. It's also changing how many people use a GPS to get around. You know, it's changing the way that we travel in just every single way. If you have specific ideas and questions and wording that you know another survey has used and that might be, just please get on my website. I'm on a working group looking at some of the changes to the next iteration of the NHTS, and I would really appreciate any thoughts you have about that.
Cell phones.
Yeah.
I also use this data in my dissertation studies, and I found that, as you mentioned, there's two measurements working. One is travel diaries, one-day travel diary. The other is weekly based workings, which is subjectively retrospect last week. I think the challenge of one travel diary measures, as you mentioned, there's only 18% of respondents report to walking on bike in a day. But the one-day travel diary, I think it's a good objective measurement, but it doesn't capture its whole, weekly basis trip schedules. In this case, how can we verify these validity issues on the travel diary measurement?
Yeah, it's really important that we do that. I have a brief on my website that looks very closely at the people and the differences between their responses on those two questions. And what he's saying is this is the one question about what'd you do last week versus the travel diary. Now, how do we verify that in the future? I think we have to just tag people at birth and make sure that they're constantly measured in all their movement until they die. But we're not going to do that. But luckily, people are carrying that thing around. And we're going to have a lot of trace data. In fact, if anybody's interested, Google Cars has released 1 day of a Google car trace data for researchers to see whether we can make sense of it. And I downloaded it. I can't make sense of it, but maybe you guys can. If you're interested, I'll send you the link. It's just out there. But the trace data is a whole nother thing. I'm also on a LinkedIn group on big data. Also offer anybody who wants to be a part of that discussion. It's kind of ongoing and sort of sometimes interesting, but this is how do we measure travel? This is a great question. What do you think?
If I have enough money, I would like to extend the travel diary period and at least 3 or 4 days rather than just 1 day.
7 days.
Yeah, but you know, people
Travel
hate
diaries.
that.
The travel diaries is where we've done a huge amount of work at the South Bay State Council of Governments, where we put GPS units on cars, and then for months, so we know where these people are stopping, everything that they're doing, and then we also have them do travel diaries and they don't match with the GPS data. People don't document their activity very well, and they don't really remember what they did very well. And so the GPS data are rich with the car, with the monitoring of the car, but then you don't know you don't know how they're walking. You don't know the trips that they take on walking or other modes, but then also the personal devices that you can put like in a handbag are horrible. So it's measuring it, so it's just, I mean, we have the technology, but it's,
Yeah, and the cell phone, it drains the battery. I mean, this is why I say we're really in a period of change. And this is, you know, it's your chapters to write. How do we do it well? How do we integrate the new data structures that we have, trace data, into our travel demand models? How do we make sense of them? How do we make sure we understand in that continuum between I never have to get out of my easy chair and I have to go forage for berries? So somewhere in there is where we are, and how do we determine where we are and where we're going to go on that continuum? This is all, you know, really the cool stuff. This is the cool stuff. How do you measure it? That's the cool stuff. If I had an answer, I'd be rich, or at least very, very well known.